Today we begin our study of the athematic, non-connecting vowel me verbs. This will be a unique category of verbs for us, and while there aren't very many me verbs, the ones that we do have are used quite regularly, so we need to spend some time working through them. We will begin today by focusing in on the indicative forms of the verb did me. Now, just to give a couple of definitions to begin. Thematic verbs are the verbs that we have studied all throughout this semester, the omega verbs and the ami verbs, and we actually even studied them in the first semester. These verbs are called thematic because they have what is called a theme vowel, which we have defined over the course of the last two semesters as a connecting vowel. Athematic verbs have no theme vowel, so the me verb doesn't have a connecting vowel, particularly in the present indicative. There will be some places like the future active where we will see the presence of a connecting vowel, but that is going to be the exception rather than the rule. And so there are really two ways that Mounce presents that you can approach this particular type of verbal form. You can either memorize the forms and Mounce numbers them at about 330, or you can learn the 5 rules that we're going to talk through today. Now, the 5 rules do not give you the assuredness of knowing exactly what you're going to see in every single instance, but they do give you some principles to follow so that you can predict what you're going to see, and so that when you're faced with something that may be a bit irregular, you can walk through the rules and find your way to what type of me verb that you are examining. In my estimation, this is a much more efficient use of our time rather than spending a significant amount of time memorizing forms, some of which you're not going to see very often at all. So through the course of the next couple of chapters, we're going to learn 4 different types of me verbs. Since did me and its various other compound forms occur probably more than any of these verbal forms, we're going to spend a lot of time in chapter 34 and in chapter 35 going over those. When we move our way into chapter 36, we're going to look at these other classes of me verbs. Now, what we'll do as we move into these other classes is we're going to use the principles that we learn to deal with the various indicative and non-indicative forms of did me with those verbal forms as well. And the principles we learn from did me are going to be very applicable with what we're going to find in the alpha class with histe me, and the epsilon class with tithe me, and the upsilon class with date me, which it appears I didn't switch over into the Greek font, so please forgive me for that. So we're going to learn these 4 classes, and we're going to work our way through them in a progressive, careful kind of fashion. All right, so rule number 1 is me verbs reduplicate their initial stem letter to form the present, and along with that the imperfect, since it is built upon the present tense stem, and they separate the reduplicated consonant with an iota. So you'll notice what happens here with did me. The root, as we saw in the previous slide, let's just point that out here. The root is this delta omicron here. That is our root. You need to know the root for each of these verbal forms as we come across them. So here, what we're going to have is the root delta omicron. It is going to reduplicate the delta. It is going to be followed by iota. What will then happen with the me verb in the first person singular form, the omicron of that root is going to lengthen to an omega, and we will be left with did do. This is our root. This is our reduplication here. This is our ending here. And we're going to be left with did me. So one of the first things to recognize with these me verbs is that you must memorize the root of the verb along with its lexical form. So when you learn did me, you need to recognize that the root of did me is delta omicron. And that root is what you're going to look for as it displays itself in a particular tense stem. You're going to be able to examine what comes before, what comes after, and those things will help you recognize what you're dealing with. So we have there at the bottom of our slide here, delta omicron is our root, and then you'll notice that there's no reduplication here, there's no augment here, and so you've got the sigma, tense formative, and your normal omega ending, and you have the future active indicative, first person singular form of doso, I will give. All right, now, here we have some various forms of didomy. What we have here are the present, the aorist, and the perfect form of didomy. So let's just take a moment. We're going to do this again at the end of our time together and look at what happens. So we've got delta omega here as our root. Let's change the color of our pencil here. Let's go back to black here. Delta omega is our root. Oops, I didn't get that. And then delta omega. And notice what happens in the plural. It goes to an omicron, which shouldn't concern us, because as we've learned all the way along, vowels are often going to change their length, and that's not going to be different when we get to the me verbs. In fact, that will be the fourth rule of me verbs that we're going to learn. So you've got your reduplication with iota here in the present tense. Did, do. And then we have our me, didos, didosin, didamen. Notice there is no connecting vowel, although it might look like that. That's not what we have. Didate and didawasin. Now you'll notice here that we have some endings that are a little bit different in the present tense, and we'll come back and talk about that when we look at rule number 3. You'll look there in the aorist, you have edoka, edokas, edokin, edokamen, edokate, and edokan. You have your augment, you have your delta omega, your augment, your delta omega, augment, delta omega, augment, delta omega, all the way through. Now the thing that might be giving you some consternation is the presence of the kappa alpha. This will be discussed later as well with rule 5, but just to whet your appetite for what's going to come, in the me verbs, they oftentimes will form their aorist form with the use of a kappa alpha tense formative rather than what we normally expect to see with the sigma alpha. Now this will not create a problem. As you see in the next to last column, you have the perfect forms. What you have in the perfect is reduplication with the delta, which you would expect. It's separated by the epsilon, and we have there dedoka, dedokas, dedokin, dedokamen, etc. And all of those endings are the same. The only place where we have the different endings are in the present active indicative. And there'll be some new endings that you're going to have to learn, 3 of them essentially. And then in the last column we have a me, which is really a me verb that we've seen a lot. It's not exactly like the others, but you do see the me, and you've got a me, a, st, esmin, este, a sin. Now, let's move on and look at our second rule. Me verbs do not ordinarily use a connecting vowel in the indicative. And we're going to look, as we get to the end of our time together today, at the various forms in the present active, imperfect active, future active, aorist active, and perfect active. And what you're going to notice in those is that they don't use a connecting vowel in any of those forms except in the future active indicative, and we'll discuss that when the time comes. So let's go back and just review for a second. First of all, rule 1, me verbs reduplicate their initial stem letter to form the present, and it separates the reduplicated consonant with an iota, rather than what we find in the perfect when it's separated with an epsilon. In fact, if you see reduplication with the iota, you know with the me verb right away it is a present tense or an imperfect tense verb. Now, rule 2, me verbs do not ordinarily use a connecting vowel in the indicative. Now, that brings us then to rule number 3. Me verbs employ 3 different personal endings in the present active. Now, the first one is very easy to remember because it's the lexical form, me. Dido me, iste me, sinthe me, date me, the verbs that we've already looked at. So the first singular is going to have the me ending. In the third singular, you're going to have sin with a movable nu. And then in the third plural, it's exactly the same. You just have an alpha added onto the front, and it's going to be sin. Okay? So let's look at this in a chart in comparison with our thematic conjugation. So first singular, you have did me and lu-o. Thematic conjugation, you have no ending. The connecting vowel is lengthened from an omicron to an omega. In the athematic me verb, it's just simply me. Now, you'll notice here, in the second singular, we have didos and lu-ace. Way back when we learned these endings, we had those little endings that were in parentheses. And so that ending that's in parentheses is a sigma. Now, you have some things that take place with the connecting vowel that will result in lu-ace, but here you have didos. So that shouldn't surprise us or mess us up too much. But in the third singular, where you have lu-a in the thematic conjugation, we have here dido sin. Now the ending is that, is the C, and we've got the movable nu, which you might see quite regularly. And then you have didamen, and notice here there's no connecting vowel, it's just simply the reduplication with iota, the root, which is our present tense then, and then the min ending, which you would expect just like what you have in the thematic conjugation. You have didate, which is exactly like what you would have in the thematic conjugation. And then we get to the third plural, and we have asin as opposed to usin. So it's very similar with the sin, the sigma iota nu, and the nu being movable. But what is a little different is that in the me verb third plural, there is that alpha that introduces it is the first letter of our ending. So take note of that. So you're going to see a lot of similarities between the third plural endings. The key thing to recognize is that alpha demonstrates that we have a third plural as opposed to a third singular where it's just didocent, which we have there. All right, now, and by the way, with these, you don't need to predict when the omicron will be an omicron in the stem and when it will be an omega. You simply have to be able to recognize, okay, this is from didomi, and to be able to parse it. You don't have to predict what it's going to be. You just simply have to recognize what you have when it presents itself. Now that brings us then to the middle passive in the present. And you'll notice here that the endings are exactly the same. You have my, si, tai, metha, ste, untai. The only place where you have something different is here in the second singular. In the second singular, in the me verb, you have didasai, whereas in the thematic conjugation, you have had the sigma leave, the epsilon and the alpha combined to give us an eta, and the iota subscripted. We learned this quite a long while ago. The reason you don't have that type of thing taking place is that in the me verb, as you can see in every one of these circumstances, there is no connecting vowel. And due to the fact that there is no connecting vowel in the second singular, the sigma does not fall out. It simply is did, da, si. Now, you have seen this happen before in the perfect middle passive indicative. In the perfect middle passive indicative, if you recall, that form does not use connecting vowels, and because it doesn't use connecting vowels, you don't have the vowel combination that you see there in the second singular form of luet. And so what happens in the perfect middle passive indicative second singular happens in the present middle passive indicative of the me verb. So you have did-a-my, did-o-si, did-o-ti, or did-a-ti, did-amatha, did-asta, did-ontai. Now, with all of those forms, you have exactly the same ending. If you compare them, my, si, ti, amatha, estha, or metha, sta, untai. All of them share the endings. The only difference is that in the thematic conjugations, you're going to see in the real world that connecting vowel, and in the me verbs, you're not. Everything else is exactly the same. So there's nothing to be concerned about in this particular instance. All that you have to essentially concern yourself with is the recognition of the fact, oh, I'm dealing with a me verb. Now that brings us to rule 4. The stem vowel of a me verb can lengthen, shorten, or drop out. And to that I would say, surprise, surprise, surprise. Well, or not. The fact of the matter is, throughout the course of the last 2 semesters, you have been confronted with the fact that vowels in the Greek language can lengthen, shorten, or drop out at the drop of a hat. They can be there and then gone. They can be short and then long, long and then short. They simply are very flexible and malleable to the situation. So what that means is, for our work in the me verbs, is that we don't need to concern ourselves with trying to predict whether that stem vowel that is a part of our root, whether it be the omicron in the ditto-mes, or the alpha in the histe-mes, or the epsilon in the tithe-mes, you don't have to predict, well, it's going to be omicron here and omega here, or alpha here and eta here, or epsilon here and eta here. We just have to be aware of the fact that it could be either one of these at any given circumstance. So that when we approach a verb and we begin to try to work through it and parse through it, we don't close off options because we don't see the length of the verb that we're expecting. Whether it be an epsilon, we might be expecting an epsilon, it's an eta, or we might be expecting an eta and it's an epsilon, or we might be expecting a vowel and it might have just left. We can't get so laser focused on one item that it could lead us into missing sort of the bigger forest for the trees kind of circumstance. Now, that brings us to rule 5. Most me verbs use a kappa alpha as the tense formative in the aorist. One of the things that we've talked about on multiple occasions is that the verb is in transition in this time period of the study of the Greek language. And so what's happening is these me verbs, which used to be way more prominent in the classical period, are moving out of the language and are being replaced with omega verb forms. Because, let's just be honest, these are a little confusing at times, and they have some similarities with the perfect here in the aorist, and there's a streamlining of the language that's taking place. So most me verbs, and we're going to look at some forms here in a moment, use the kappa alpha as the tense formative in the aorist rather than the sigma alpha. Now, if you were to compare what you have with a me verb and a regular first aorist verb, they're going, in terms of the endings, they're going to look exactly the same, except the sigma of the tense formative in the paradigm that you know for the first aorist active indicative is going to be replaced by a kappa. Everything else essentially looks the same. So let's look at a chart here. Notice there in the first, or the second and third column, you have edoka, elusa. So both of them have, you'll notice, both have augment. Both have a stem. In the terms of did-a-me, it's do. With lu-o, it's lu. And then you have sigma alpha, and you've got kappa alpha. Here we have the augment in both instances, the stem do, the stem lu, kappa alpha, and the sigma ending. Sigma alpha and the sigma ending. And it goes on from there. Edoken is compared to elusin. Edokamen is compared to elusamen. Edokate is compared to elusate, edokan to elusan. Now, notice then the second and fourth columns. Okay, in the fourth column, we have our perfect form of the regular verb, the omega verb, the thematic conjugation. And you'll see how these look very similar. Edoka leluka, edokas lelukas, edokin lelukin. So they're going to look like perfects, but they're not perfects because they do not have reduplication with that epsilon. That epsilon with edoka, edokas, edokin is an augment. It is not the epsilon that is a part of reduplication. So you have edoka, edokas, edokin, edokamen, edokata, edokan. Those are the same endings that you've had before in the first aorist. The only difference is that the sigma of the tense formative, the sigma of the sigma alpha tense formative, has been replaced with a kappa. Everything else looks exactly the same and should not cause you any problems. Now that brings us then to our examination of didomi in the indicative mood. So we have didomi, didos, didosin, didamen, didata, didowasin. We've looked through that. Now look at the imperfect. The imperfect has the augment in every instance. Let's just look at the first three here. All of them have the augment. All of them have reduplication with Yoda. You can see that well. All of them are followed by the delta omicron, delta omicron, delta omicron. So what's happened, we have omicron of our stem and the on of our on SN, ominetta on, those have combined to give us omicron upsilon, edidoo. Okay, you have the omicron of our dida that has combined with the epsilon of the epsilon sigma ending in the secondary active endings, and we have edidus. Omicron plus epsilon equals, ooh, what a mess. Our epsilon crab has been blown to bits. All right, and then we have the same type of thing happen in the third singular, edidoo, the epsilon of the ending on SN has combined with the omicron of the stem, and we have edidoo. Now we get to the plural, you'll notice edidamen, there's nothing for the omicron to combine with. Edidata, again, nothing for it to combine with. And then edidoo, where the omicron combines with the omicron, remember on SN, amen, eta, on, edidoo. And the way you can tell the first singular from the third plural is context. Now, the future is unique in the forms of didomy in the indicative active. So future form of didomy is just exactly like what you've seen with the future active indicative forms of the omega verb. You have so, sace, say, samen with an omicron, seta, and susan. So you're going to have the exact same thing. The way that you know this is a me verb is because of the delta omega. The delta omega is our future active tense stem. And so the fact that you see delta omega tells you this is from didomy. Every one of them have the sigma tense formative. It's followed by a connecting vowel, followed by the primary active endings. And this is exactly like what you've already learned. Now, you see there in the last two columns a comparison of edoka and dedoka. You'll notice that the only difference between the aorist, this kappa aorist form of didomy, edoka, edokas, edokin, edokamen, edokata, edokan, is, and then the perfect, is that in the perfect you have delta epsilon. It's dedoka, dedokas, dedokin, dedokamen, dedokata, dedokan, which is exactly what you should expect with the perfect. The perfect looks essentially exactly like the perfect active indicative forms that you're going to learn in all of your omega verbs. The aorist differs from the first aorist active indicative in the thematic omega verbs simply because you have the kappa there as opposed to a sigma. So you have edoka, edokas, edokin, edokamen, edukate, edukan. So we've walked through very carefully all of the forms of didomy in the present indicative and the present middle passive indicative. We've looked at the active forms of the imperfect, the future, the aorist, and the perfect. This is a great resource for you. The only place where you're going to have any real significant oddities are in the 3 different endings that you find in the present active indicative and in what takes place in the aorist, where you have the kappa aorist. If you can get your mind around those 2 things, the rest of this should fall into place fairly simply, and your enjoyment of the me verbs should grow quite exponentially. Look forward to working through the homework with you. I pray that you have a blessed day.